Today I'll be telling the story of Enya, a hairdresser who immigrated from Cuba. In Cuba, my childhood was very nice. I lived in a nice house with my mother, father, and 2 sisters. I was raised in the capital of Cuba, Havana. Although my childhood was nice, I always knew there was something wrong with the country I called home. I would constantly hear my family whispering about the communist dictator who had taken over and changed our life for the worst. My family, as you can see from the photo, is very close, so to hear my parents and older sisters constantly whispering about the country we lived in always put some doubts in my head. I started college at 16 at the University of El Salvador in Cuba. This is when I truly started to realize what kind of country I lived in. Cuba was all I had ever known, but to finish my teaching degree, I had to go to Iraq. We were only allowed to travel to Iraq because their country was in similar turmoil as Cuba. But there was one thing that was different in Iraq than it was in Cuba. They weren't under communist rule. I had realized then that I had to leave Cuba and find a new life for myself. I was recently dating my soon-to-be husband, Alejandro, and he agreed to leave Cuba with me. As I said before, Cuba was almost impossible to leave, so we bought plane tickets to Panama. When we got to Panama, our journey truly began. We only had the clothes on our back. We didn't have any family photos or anything, but we wanted to get to Mexico from Panama, and the only way that was possible was to swim partially through the Panama Canal and travel on land until we reached Mexico. When we got to Mexico, we had to run across the border into the United States. All I remember was praying that border security wouldn't find me, because if they did, they would send me back to Cuba. My husband and I eventually made it to Florida. We felt safe there because many Cuban immigrants first go to Florida when they arrive in the United States, so we were not alone on our journey. During this time, the Wet Foot, Dry Foot Act was in place, so once we were in the United States, we could be granted citizenship once we talked to immigration. I arrived at the U.S. Department of Immigration in Florida on July 5th, 1980. At that point, I had to beg to a judge not to send my husband and I back to Cuba, because if he did, we would be killed or placed into jail. The judge granted us citizenship, and we were able to begin our lives in America. Soon after moving to the United States, I got pregnant with my son, Robert. So I began doing hair in an attempt to make some money to support our family and child. My business soon boomed, and I was chosen to compete in a celebrity hairstyle competition, which I later won. The press from this gave me the ability to open my own salon, Creations Hair and Spa. This gave me the economic freedom that I needed to raise my son and to begin to think about who I left in Cuba. My husband and I had to leave everything and everyone we knew back in Cuba. We had no pictures, we had nothing except the clothes on our back, and we had no family. We did this because we couldn't risk the possibility of us not being able to leave Cuba. Shortly after my son Robert was born, I lost my husband to cancer. This made me feel more alone in America than I ever had been, and I realized that my son deserved to grow up with the family that I did in Cuba, and I was determined to bring my family over to give Robert the same childhood that I did. The first person I brought over was my mother. It took years and a lot of expensive payments to get her to America, where she was granted citizenship. This is one of the first times America truly felt like home. 2 years later, I was able to bring over both my sisters and the families that they had created back in Cuba. I realized that when I was in America and while they were in Cuba, my sisters and mother aged, continued with their lives, but the love between us never changed. With my whole family in America, America began to feel like our final and true home. My son got the life he deserved, and he got to be raised with the same people that I did. My journey was long and hard. I don't have any photos from my childhood. I had to live with the death of my husband who helped me get here, and I had to raise my son alone for a few years. But once I got my family to come to America, my whole life changed, and I do not regret coming to the country.